cool.
All right, and now I'm recording. So, Hannah, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Sure. Any questions about anything Sarah just said before we get going?
Since I didn't actually have the record button going, our guest speakers are sick tonight, so we are redoing what we're doing. So you haven't missed anything if you thought you were coming here to see a guest speaker and they're not on the screen.
Okay. So last time we started talking about 3E students, kids who are disabled, gifted, and part of a minoritized group. And we spent a lot of time talking about EMLs and how they are often not identified either as gifted or disabled. Some groups of children we know are overrepresented in gifted education. White and Asian kids tend to be overrepresented, while Black and Latino kids tend to be underrepresented. Another group, though, that is overrepresented in gifted education, and not because of any kind of external force like systemic racism, is kids in the LGBTQ plus community. Not only are they more likely to be gifted than their non-LGBTQ plus peers, but they are also more likely to have a disability. So recently, the county added the ability for students to have X as their gender marker in Synergy and in their file. And we've got like 270 total students in the county who have X as their marker right now. And what was it, like half of them, Sarah, are also coded as gifted. So it's a very
like 50%, I think, were coded as gifted.
So there isn't a lot of information about the mechanisms behind that and why that is. I have some personal theories, but they're not scientifically validated, so I will keep them to myself. But it's something that is very
I think you should share, because I think it's actually really valid.
Okay.
Because it's personal knowledge, but also it does support some of the research on this specifically is hard to do. So I think, what you're talking about does kind of summarize some of the research that's out there.
So what I think, the reason why I think that there are more gifted LGBTQ plus kids is that there are actually more kids that are LGBTQ plus than are ready and capable of identifying themselves as such in school. So when you're young, to have that kind of sense of yourself and your identity, that takes a lot of introspection and a lot of emotional intelligence. So my thinking is that there is a more typical percentage of gifted people in the LGBTQ plus population, and that as they age, when they reach adulthood, that percentage becomes more comparable to the general population. But because these kids are bright enough to recognize who they are at such a young age, they are also gifted, but it's not caused by them being LGBTQ. Does that make sense? Questions about that? That's my own theory.
And the part of the research that
it's a good theory. I was just saying, yeah, that's a good theory. It makes sense to me.
Okay, cool. I'm glad it made sense outside of my head.
I was going to say part of the research that has been done on it, and it is older research within the last 10 years. So it's kind of also hard to say that's older research when the field is so new. But there was also, I think kind of in the same line of what Hannah's saying, that people in the LGBTQ plus community tend to show more traits of creativity and creative thinking, which are one of the measures that we use to measure giftedness. And so it's not surprising when you see people who have to be, think of themselves more flexibly and have to think of, how they may or may not fit into things in a different way and more creative way. It wouldn't be unusual to have them identified more frequently as gifted. That is me summarizing a 150-page paper into 4 sentences, so there's definitely more to it. But it goes back, I think, also to what Rick was talking about a couple weeks ago about how there's better ways to measure for giftedness than just IQ scores. And when we look at things like those creativity measures, the flexible and critical thinking, and just some of those different pieces, it really is, it's an interesting topic. Yes, the advocacy as well. If you're having to be able to advocate for your own identity, there's other things that you can advocate for, and building self-advocacy skills is a part of and the speed at which you build them can be a part of some of the gifted identity as well. One of the things I also think is really interesting, and Hannah and I were actually looking this up, and it speaks really to where people are at with their willingness to identify as X, or their interest in identifying as X within Montgomery County, because we know that that is self-selection. That means, I believe, your parents have to support you making that change in the system. Like, there's a whole bunch of things that have to go into it. When I talk to the students who are in our high school programs, I would say the vast majority of our twice exceptional kids who are in those programs identify themselves as somewhere on the spectrum, on the gender spectrum, but they don't like to define themselves. So a lot of times they'll stick with what the gender they have on paper is, but that's not necessarily what they identify as. So just like everything else, I think we know it's underrepresented in terms of research. Like, we know that it's not, that the population itself might not be underrepresented in terms of identification, but our ability to research it, because it has to be children willing to self-identify where they are in their own process of understanding who they are, it makes it a really difficult thing to research really cleanly. So I really appreciate Hannah putting out her ideas around that, because I think it's important when we're talking about a community that is, especially for this age group, very hard to research.
Other questions before we move on? Okay. The other thing that we need to consider is gender. So something that I hear a lot from parents, because I teach middle school, and that's when a lot of disabilities become apparent, especially if a child is gifted and able to kind of coast with their disability. Up until then, when the cognitive demand gets harder, there's more demands on their executive functioning, is that a parent might say, well, my son has ADHD and my daughter she doesn't act like him. Or that the children are not the same, so they can't possibly have the same diagnosis. That leads to the underdiagnosis of ADHD and autism in girls. So boys tend to externalize, which means that their symptoms tend to come out and affect other people, whereas girls internalize. So girls will have a lot of anxiety, they will have a lot of internal symptoms that aren't necessarily visible to other people. And Sarah has shared before, the reason she was diagnosed with ADHD as a child was because she presented like a boy with ADHD. She was externalizing. She made it everyone else's problem. Recently, the NIH, I think it was 2020, around there, published some research that found that 80% of girls with autism remain undiagnosed at their 18th birthday. And the implication for you as educators is that the majority of girls with autism in your classrooms or in your offices are undiagnosed. So very few girls who have autism are diagnosed when they are in public schools. And that can lead to a lot of issues for them, because it is difficult to be autistic in a neurotypical world. And it is difficult for any child who has any kind of neurodivergence to not know their diagnosis, because that helps them understand how their brain works and the kind of things that they need to move throughout the world. Okay, so in the chat, I stand by, the DSM is written for white males and white males only. Women and minorities are underrepresented and under-researched. And that's absolutely true. Even today, the majority of studies on autism and the majority of studies on ADHD are done exclusively on males. There was a period of time when women were completely excluded from medical research because researchers worried that the menstrual period and the cycle would disrupt their results and would make them invalid. And yes, race is also an issue here, whereas children who are white might be diagnosed with ADHD, children who are Black or Latino might be diagnosed with ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder. Oppositional defiant disorder in the DSM-5 is characterized by continually disregarding authority, by being argumentative, by arguing with people. It's a controversial diagnosis, and it tends to accompany other diagnoses. It's not one that you tend to see on its own. So a child tends to be diagnosed with an emotional disability and ODD, or ADHD and ODD or autism and ODD. So for a lot of people, it's not necessarily the most valid or the best diagnosis to represent a child's needs, because all of those things that you see there could just be manifestations of that child being autistic or that child having ADHD and having a brain that works differently from other people's. And Sarah just dropped in the chat a link to a podcast from the Neurodiversity podcast on oppositional defiant disorder, which you should all check out. Not right now, but later after class. Okay. Questions about gender or other comments? Because these comments are awesome. Okay. So the other thing that we need to talk about before we move into poverty is the difference between giftedness and achievement. Achievement refers to grades and test scores. How high is a kid performing? Giftedness and achievement are not the same thing. Giftedness is that high level of ability, and that could be verbal ability, it could be visual, spatial, perceptual ability, it could be musical or athletic ability. You can be gifted in a lot of different ways. Often, kids who are gifted also achieve high in school. That is not always the case. A child can be very gifted and not do well in school. That's the case for a lot of twice exceptional learners, but it's also the case for gifted kids who have external factors like poverty. Okay, let me see. It now manifests in AI. If you ask someone to generate images of someone with ADHD or autism, it's almost entirely white boys or men. Yeah, and that's because AI, it's trained in data sets that are provided by what's available to the public. And the majority of representation in media of people with autism especially is men. Highly recommend reading Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. It's insane the amount they're overlooked, and even more so for minorities. Thank you, Kelly. It's a good recommendation. Okay, giftedness and poverty. Very few kids living in poverty are identified as gifted. We know that kids living in poverty are most likely to be Hispanic, Black, or Native American. Those racial groups are the same racial groups that are least likely to be identified as gifted, whether or not those kids are living in poverty. Now, in research, and if you guys are interested in reading some of this research, I put links in the speaker notes here. In research on gifted students, students taking advanced coursework like AP and IB, kids living in poverty have the same reasons for doing so as kids not living in poverty. So when surveyed, they said, well, I want to be challenged. I want to take the more advanced class. I want to learn more. But they were highly affected by three groups of people: their friends and whether they were taking those advanced classes, their teachers and whether they encouraged them to take advanced classes, and their family and whether their family had the expectation that they would take those advanced classes. So as teachers, we can't really affect whether the kids' friends are doing it. We can reach out to family though, and we can encourage them to encourage their child. And we can certainly encourage kids living in poverty and kids from minoritized group to challenge themselves to take the advanced coursework. Some of the challenges that these kids ran into were in their other responsibilities. Often teenagers in poverty have to work to support their families, and it can be very socially and emotionally taxing to be taking advanced coursework, which requires more work, not just more rigor than other courses, and to be working and to balance that. The last point on this slide is that a school's rate of poverty inversely predicts the percentage of identified gifted students. So an inverse prediction means that as the rate of poverty increases, the rate of children identified as gifted decreases. Okay. Thank you, Ashley, for that link in the chat. Okay. So low achievement, low academic achievement is associated with poverty. And remember, that is not the same thing as ability. Achievement is a measure of how well children do on tests, on evidence of learning measures, on essays, on overall grades. Often children living in poverty have lower academic achievement, and that could be they have fewer opportunities. They have other responsibilities that get in the way of schoolwork. And so that could be one reason why they're less likely to be identified as gifted. It could be that their parents or their families don't have the opportunity to advocate for them, or the knowledge that they can advocate for them to be identified as gifted, or they don't have the time because they're working and they're busy. But the one that is most directly actionable is under referral by teachers. So giftedness does not look the same in this group of children as it might in children who live in financially stable families and families who are living above the poverty line, because those kids have more opportunities. And Monica says, I emphasize the true definition of achievement in my role on a daily basis. It is truly critical. Yes, achievement is not the same as ability. Okay. Some solutions that work at different levels. Hold on. In one of the articles I read from the course, it stated 2E students who are minority and or lower economic stats have less chance of being able to enroll in gifted classes because they are talked out of it by counselors. They already have a stigma placed on them before even looking into their ability. Kathy, thank you for sharing that, because it's absolutely true. I worked with a teacher this past year who was Latina, and she shared with me that her counselor in high school told her that she shouldn't bother applying to college because she wouldn't make a good teacher. And if she had listened, we would be short one more teacher who looks like our kids and who can help them know that they don't have to listen to people like that counselor. So one thing that increases the number of students living in poverty who are identified as gifted is universal screening. That is something we do in MCPS. Another thing is to use domain-specific performance indicators. So these kids might not look gifted when you consider the overall academic picture, because again, that's based on grades. But if you consider, okay, well, they might be verbally gifted or they might be mathematically gifted, they might be more likely to reach those domains. Local norming is really important. We talked a bit about this last time, but local norming means you are comparing them to an alike population. So if you are marking the top, let's say 20% of kids as gifted, and you are using a national norm, an average of all children in the country, those children might perform better on tests of achievement than children who are living in poverty. And so the kids who are living in poverty are not going to reach that top threshold that is necessary to be identified as gifted. But if you compare them to another cluster or another group of kids living in poverty, then you might still see that they are at the top 20% of that group. So the norm group should be representative of the population it is being used for. And then the last solution that was offered in the research was to use challenging curriculum for all students. So you start off by using advanced curriculum for everyone, and then you see which kids are really taking to it, which ones are being successful when you're using that. And that can help you identify which of the kids may be gifted. Let me see. So Monica said, this is interesting. Having been a psychologist who conducted IQ testing for gifted eligibility in a different school district, students had two different plans, Plan A and Plan B, and their IQ minimum requirements differed. We do have a slight difference in gifted identification for some special populations here as well. So students who are EMLs, some kids with IEPs, kids who are in community schools, which are schools with 70% or more farms, and kids who themselves receive farms need to score in the 70th percentile or higher on measures of academic achievement, whereas the general population needs to score in the 80th percentile or higher.
And that's all. The thing also to remember with MCPS is currently things are set up is that, like I've said before, every score that we currently use is achievement based. So it's again an important thing to know that even with those lower thresholds, it's still not necessarily capturing the students that we're looking to capture. So it is important that we use the local norming. It's also important that we use a variety of data points. Primary talent development is a great program. It's something that we do. It's a partnership between AEI and Title I office, where we have people who are in a position to do the primary talent development coaching for K2 in schools. We used to use some of that data, and we're trying to find a pathway that is one of the things we're talking about. I think I said before, I have like 9 pathways I want to see us use. One of them is to use the information that our primary talent development coaches collect across the 3 years that they are doing the work with that population. It's always kind of a double-edged sword because, on the one hand, we hear from teachers all the time, we used to take teacher recommendations, or we used to do um, teacher feedback. It used to be a school-based decision as to whether or not a student was identified as gifted. And the reason that that changed was because, as much as it helped some students in some schools, we also found there were some schools out there that were identifying 50% or more of their students as gifted. When the schools had the ability to make those determinations, we were finding that parent influence on the teachers of it was just easier to mark the kid as gifted than it was to really push back and say your kid's not meeting criteria. Um, and there were also many, many cases of students where the data would come back and show in those gifted ranges, including cognitive scores, and the teams would go, oh, that must be a mistake. And they wouldn't code the kids as gifted. And we all know that those stories are true because oftentimes those are the kids with behavior issues. And eventually I would find them and I would go look at their COG scores. I would look at the scores that we had from whatever they did in the classroom. And I would look at these scores from the years that they should have been looked at for gifted identification, and they weren't identified. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. But if you go back in the IEP, you can see all the behavior issues they were having with the student. And so as much as people, really want to believe that they're not biased in what their beliefs are, we know that we are, that bias is inherent. And one of the things that we did as a county to try and remove some of that bias was to remove multiple layers of person input and rely more on data. The flip side of that, of course, is that it's performance data and it's not data that's good for all of our students, and it doesn't always show their strengths. And I see in the chat, talking about some of these processes that we go through. What I do find interesting was way back, and I'm saying it was probably close to 20 years at this point. I remember at some point Gaithersburg High School was piloting basically honors ESOL classes, I believe is what they called them. And it was classes for our students who were really EML 1-2, and they were doing like NSL and other things that were more self-contained. But the content was much more rigorous, and they were doing a lot more with vocabulary work. It was for students who, did have what you might consider as like a gifted profile, but they didn't necessarily have like not being English speakers was the barrier. And so what they did to support that was having the students together where they could have intensive English instruction as well as intensive content instruction. I don't know whatever happened to those classes. And I only know it existed because I actually was substitute teaching in one of them, and I was there when the teacher was on jury duty, so I got to be with them for like 2 weeks. It was an amazing class, and I do wish that I do wish that we had more initiatives like that that combined our efforts a little bit more. And I think I got us off track, and I apologize. The link that I put in the bio, the Bernardo's narrative, so that is it's the narrative of a twice exceptional it's a narrative of a twice exceptional Latino male who um, immigrated, not immigrated, immigrated when he was in about high school, I believe it was. And he talks about kind of the difference of, how he was in his school system from where he came from to how he was treated as being both a non-English speaker, or rather what was considered a non-English speaker. He actually did, I believe, speak English, but he was still labeled as an EML learner, and then also having an IEP. And he speaks to counselors dissuading him from going to school to become an architect, and pushing him out of classes. And he speaks to his own narrative, and he now has a PhD in education. But he kind of takes you through that journey of how he never actually, when he did finally get his architecture degree, he actually never did anything with it because by the time he got it, he had kind of gone on a different pathway. But just kind of that experience that he and his friends had and how they were treated coming in not only as English learners, but also as people with disabilities. So I 100% pulled it out of the book, and whether or not I was supposed to is up for debate. But I definitely would encourage you guys to read that when you have a moment, and I will try and remember to put it up in the class, in the Canvas section. Oh, I remember. Yeah, so Monica mentioned that, when you were in a different school system, different district, that there were different plans with IQ scores. And it is interesting because there are some districts that will have different IQ scores for different populations. There are some districts that, like we use the 90th percentile as the threshold if we're going to use a threshold, and it's not a yes or no kind of thing, but when I'm looking at the numbers, we know that 120 90th percentile is what we tend to look at. There are other districts that won't look at anything over or under 95th percentile. So it's a really interesting discussion on kind of how and why different districts do different things. And then that kind of goes back to what Hannah's saying is, for IQ scores, we use the 90th percentile, but for achievement scores, we use the 80th and sometimes down to the 70th percentile. So it really is a vast range of the information we're using, and then also how we're using it, but also different ranges for different types of assessments. So it's not a static one across the board.
Yeah, and Sarah, I can add because I had about 30 evals for gifted when I did them, but in that school district they had like various like resources. They had the gifted, the IQ was part of it, the achievement testing, like we have like the maps, like the MCAP or MAP scores, and then they had the creativity rating scale that teachers had to complete for their students. But it was interesting the different criteria. A lot of my kids that were Plan B that were in the population where they got free reduced lunch, that's how it was determined. A lot of them would meet the criteria, but then my kids who were on full lunch that had to get a score of 130 or above, they would have meet it by 1 point, and then the kids who are 122, 123, they would meet the. So it was just, industry would be a discussion a lot of us would have together.
And that's a lot of what, when we're talking about the problems with things like thresholds, and that's something that I've definitely pushed back on since I've been in this position, is I think the threshold is an important discussion point, but it shouldn't be a barrier point.
Yes, that was something we discussed a lot. I understand the differences in resources, but that was a discussion a lot of psychologists had together, because we would be testing 5 to 6 students a day, and then 3 of them would be eligible and the other ones wouldn't, just based on 1 or 2 points. But that was just
That's
a bit of
why
a discussion.
those 1 or 2 points are important, but that's also
Yeah.
why we look at subtests. And
Mm-hmm.
not to get too into the weeds, since I said I think you're my only psychologist right now. But it's also why we look at the subtest scores, and it's also why we look at confidence intervals. Because a confidence interval is basically saying, if we tested this kid again in a year, we expect that they would fall within the same range. And so
yeah, we would use our SEM, our standard area of measurement, at times too. So yeah.
And that's when I have a kid who makes score a 119, and our again, if we use the threshold of 120, but that confidence interval goes up to 126, it's a hard discussion to have. And that's why I think the importance with all of our identification and all of our different groups is the data is meant to drive discussion. And yes, sometimes we have that hard, fast line. But I also will have discussions with parents where they're like, they missed this by 1 point. And I'm like, well, they missed that one score by 1 point, but they had 4 different ways that they could have made it. And if they've missed it on every single solitary one, and it's just that one they missed by 1 point, we have to consider all the other things that they didn't hit either. Now, if they missed every single one of those by 1 point, that's why we have our rescreening process. And one thing I think I've said before is that up until this past year, when you were doing screening, you were either a yes, a no, or a rescreen. We got rid of no. So you're now either a yes or a rescreen unless you ask to have your child removed from the universal screening process. And that is a change from what we've had in the past. And I think it's a really good change, because I think it's a change, that will it will allow us, kids peak at different times, and it will allow us to look at more kids at later dates when they have had more school exposure, when they have maybe had a chance to find something more interesting about school, and really be able to show us who they are as thinkers and learners. So Hannah, is that the end of,
That is the end of the equity slides. There was one other question we did not discuss in the chat. Let me find it again. It was about portfolios and identification. Oops. That is something a lot of my teachers are asking. What is the point of portfolio data collection and how does it actually factor into identifying gifted students?
so yeah, that's what I was kind of touching on before. It currently doesn't, and it makes me very dissatisfied. It's frustrating because you guys do a lot of work and we get a lot of good data on that. I think the good side of it is that we know that, you know, within your school, you're hopefully at least using it as part of your vertical articulation process. But we did used to use that data. We used it more when identification was in the hands of the school. So I'm kind of making this up a little bit, but essentially what you would do is you'd have your administration, your reading specialist, your second grade team, everybody would sit around, you'd look at each kid individually, all the scores, and in schools where you had the primary talent development PTD coach, they would be there as well, and they would bring the portfolios for each of the kids to the table, and it would be all a part of that large discussion. The process did change, and I talked about why that process changed. The part of the process that changed that we have not done a great job of recapturing, but is a very active discussion in our office, is going back to those portfolios specifically so that we can use them as an additional data point. So while hopefully what you're using them for is articulation, so that even if it's not flagging the student, you can talk to the third grade teacher, for each level to up to third grade. This is what the student's showing, this is where they show strength, this is where they're growing, so that their instructor knows that. What we don't do a great job of is saying, look at this growth over time. This child really should be identified as gifted because they're not a great test taker, but they're showing us all of these other skills. And we're not doing a good job of that. So I think, like we've said before, in some ways, we're aware. It doesn't fall on deaf ears. It's not very satisfying to know that it's not going anywhere right now, but it is a part of our discussion and a part of our process. And like everything else, if we want to make changes to the process for gifted identification for, say, this year, 24-25, I believe we were supposed to have initially presented some of those changes back in January. And so we did present some changes in January. We presented some changes the year before. But then also, like everything else, progress is slow. And people get really into the weeds sometimes when they don't understand all the data, and they're trying to understand it, but in trying to understand it, if they don't, they might ask us to make changes to some of those pathways. And I know one of the concerns becomes, well, only Title I schools have these PTD coach positions, so only kids in Title I schools have these portfolios. And is that fair? My answer is yes. They're in a Title I school, they need extra resources and support. This is one of those extra resources and support, and this is how we should be using it. Not everybody approaches life that way. So, there it becomes some of those questions, and that's something that I really hope that we can make a faster change to in the future, is doing a better job of using the portfolios as a research and as a data point for those students so that we can do a better job of identifying specifically in Title I schools, because we know that's also where not only our students in poverty or low socioeconomic access, but a lot of our students of color are there as well, and they're also being missed, and this is an opportunity for them to be looked at differently.
I think that kind of falls like where my initial thoughts were at before taking this class. I don't think I had the language to like say that these portfolios could be the most helpful with twice exceptional children, but like my kind of thought process to my teachers is like, this could be really helpful information for students that may not be hitting our like data markers, like MAP scores, things like that. But we see these behaviors in them and we're like, wow, they are really showing a high level of ability. Like, what else do we need to do to advocate for them or like fill in gaps? So I think that this class has helped like clarify some of that for me, to bring back to my teachers on like why we're doing this. Cause it is, it is a lot of work. And to be fair, like, why are we doing this? And so I think that.
And you guys also, at the end of the day, I think sometimes it feels like we've asked you guys to fill out a folder and then that folder doesn't go anywhere. So even if you're using the data, it doesn't always feel like we're honoring the work that you're doing, which we do. We just want to honor it more. So I appreciate you bringing that up for sure. And, you know, the only other piece I ever have with this is, you know, if you hear that, you know, we try to put out with PTD stuff, you know, we do try to put out when we're going to the board to talk about the role of PTDs or the process of gifted identification. If you do hear that coming up and you want to speak on behalf, you know, from your position, you can always sign up for, I think you get 5 minutes in front of the board to say your piece. And that's
I think
never.
my school is a unique kind of school in that we just became Title I last year. And so I've been kind of in a different position than the other coaches of like, this is totally new to my school, whereas other schools have been doing it for like 6, 7 years. So it could be interesting to, you know, look at schools, like their data before and after, like my particular school, like how many kids over the next few years, like have been identified versus like in the past. Yeah.
That would be wonderful, you know, data to look at or track, or even sometimes, honestly, it's data that I can pull, but if you don't ask me to, I got a lot on my plate. But if you come and say, hey, could we sit down and have a 30-minute data chat and look at the data for my school, I'm happy to do that. And there's plenty of times we found some really interesting patterns when we've done that. Whether or not leads to identification, not necessarily, but whether or not leads to changes in how we're cluster grouping students or how schools are making instructional decisions. We have made changes before based on some of those just kind of random data dives that we do. Okie dokie. I think I've been desperately looking for this one thing for this one slide, and I am going to, I think, suck it up and get over it. I want to, I think, take us into some discussions around strength-based instruction. I know that Claire talked about it when we talked about that Trellis and Bloom model for, you know, creating an actual lesson plan. But what I really want to talk about in this section are some more concrete things that we do as far as best practices go for our twice exceptional students. I think, as always, you know, at the end of this section, we often get, this is good for all students, 100%. You know, most of what we tell you guys in best practices, it always comes back to necessary for some, what is it, like, you know, required for some, necessary for others, and should be available to all. So when we're talking about these, you know, we want to talk about through the lens of twice exceptional, because that's what we're talking about. And really, you know, maximizing when we talk about, you know, where are their strengths and what can we do to better play to those strengths. That's kind of what we're looking at here, but they really are practices that are good for many students. So I'm going to start our slideshow, and then I'm going to still try and have us get to a good stopping point at 8 o'clock for our break, and then we will go from there. Oh, you know what? Hold on. Normally that's a smart thing to do, but I'm actually going to share the whole screen, because as I've learned, sometimes I have websites that pop up that we want to see, and we want to see them. All right, so best practices in twice exceptional ed. And like I said, this section is really going to talk about some more concrete pieces. We've done a lot of theoretical, partly because I really like theoretical, but I also know that, you know, it's important for everyone to also have things that they can walk away with. So when we're talking about strength-based instruction, we want to think about it, and I might be getting over this, so if you guys can think of a better visual metaphor for this. Right now I have it as like the FDA plate, like we want a well-balanced meal, we want well-balanced instruction. I'm really over this metaphor, so if you can think of a new one, please do. But we want to talk about kind of the different areas that we think about when we're talking about our twice exceptional kids. So, you know, the one part that we talk about the least is really the interventions. And the interventions are really when we're talking about shoring up areas of weakness, or looking specifically at if a student has a specific learning disability, providing an intervention around that specific learning disability. if they have an executive functioning disability, providing direct instruction around that executive functioning disability. It is a part of strength-based instruction because we do need to learn whether they're coping strategies or compensatory strategies. We need our students to learn how to own and accept their disability and then be able to either mitigate or balance it out. So we don't want to lose track of that when we're talking about our strength-based instruction. But we also want to remember when we're talking about strengths first, the intervention piece is one piece of this broader puzzle, and it shouldn't be the sole focus of how we're meeting their needs. So FYI, the book that I'm looking for, I have like texted 3 different people to say, what is the book with the fish on the cover? Because that's the only thing I remember about this book. And I now have people sending me pictures of their bookshelves asking me if this is the book. So if I keep looking at my phone, that would be why. I'm hoping to find the books because that is actually a part of this presentation. So we have accelerated and enriched instruction. And the quote that I rely on when I talk about our instruction for gifted and twice exceptional students is that, we talk about, everybody should be able to learn every single day. And I believe that everyone should have the access to learn every single day. But I also believe that if you're not learning something new every single day, then why are you bothering going to school? School, yes, there's social emotional learning. There's, all sorts of different types of learning. But for many of our kids, whether it's a unit or the entire school year, if you walk in the door and you already know what the teacher's going to teach, and you're not having the opportunity to explore in depth or learn anything new, school is literally a holding pattern. It is a waste of your time. And so it's, to me, I believe everybody has the right to access education every single day, but I also believe that everybody has the opportunity to learn something, should have the opportunity to learn something new every day. And to me, that's often what leads down that discussion around accelerated enriched instruction, because otherwise it is a waste of time. And we also know with these profiles, when the kids feel like their time is being wasted, they are going to come up with other things to do with their time. And it's not always what we want them to do. So that to me becomes one of the big pieces of this, the why of why we look at our strength-based instruction. So we have the accommodations piece, and kind of alongside with the interventions, the accommodations are part of that leveling of the playing field. They're the way, the how they're going to do them. The interventions are addressing very specific things, very specific weaknesses or very specific needs, whereas the accommodations, which when I talk about accommodations in the sense, I do include our supplementary aids and services. Technically, those are different things. Accommodations are things mostly we can use on state testing, and sub aids and services are things that we use mostly in the classroom during instruction. For my purpose, I lump them all together because this isn't an IEP meeting. We don't have to talk about them separately. But to me, the accommodations are the accessibility points. So, we often will talk about accommodations being like, building the ramp so that somebody can get where they need to get to, or we talk about, everybody, most people have access to a keyboard. Some kids really need the keyboard, but some kids also need direct instruction on how to use that keyboard and how to organize their files and how to, be able to access certain information. So that's kind of where we're splitting between when we have an intervention with that specific instruction versus the accommodations, which is the access. And then when we talk about our strength-based instruction, one thing that we often forget about is not only the social emotional support. I know we've spent a lot of time on social emotional, and we need to, because that is a big part of this profile. But this is also for especially our counselors, our psychologists. I know you don't technically do the case management part, but you are a part of that larger building of a case and a case profile. And our school counselors as well, because oftentimes our kids who have 504s need that case management more so than twice exceptional kids with 504s need more case management than kids who have 504s in general, because our kids tend to have more of those social emotional needs, which don't necessarily rise to the level of needing specialized instruction, but they do need somebody who can, talk them through their stress or can teach them a little bit around the self-advocacy piece, or really help them kind of navigate their way through some of the stress and the doubt around, do they really belong in the advanced classes? Or oftentimes our kids with 504s are fighting battles with their teachers to be allowed to have their accommodations. I have heard on more than one occasion somebody tell me that 504 accommodations are not required by law. They're only necessary if a kid asks for them directly. And honestly, that was something I was told when I first started. And I came from gen ed to special ed. So I kind of bypassed 504s. I never really had a student with a 504 just because of the pathway I came up. But 504s are legal documents and they are legally required. And the only major difference between the 504s and the IEPs is that one is backed by IDEA and the other is backed by Americans with Disabilities Act. Section 504 can go into, I'll go with the real world. IEPs don't follow you out of K-12 education. Those are some of the differences. It doesn't make one better than the other, but the important part is they are still both legal documents and the students are entitled to the supports and everything else that we have in those documents. And so making sure that we know what's in them, but also making sure, the case managers do that case management piece and help our kids with their advocacy and accessing what they need is an important piece of supporting our twice exceptional kids. So I'm gonna hop through some parts of this quickly because I think some of this, I like this one. I think it was Claire who talked to us about this. And if you can't read it because it's blurry, it says, our teacher has an interesting theory. She says, teaching is like bowling. All you can do is roll the ball down the middle and hope you touch most of the students. And Charlie Brown says, well, she must be a terrible bowler. And this goes back to that whole teaching for the edge and everything else, right? Like if we always aim for the middle, we're going to knock down a bunch of pins, but we're going to miss a lot of pins, and we're probably going to consistently miss the same pins. So I like cartoons, right? We're not surprised by this. Differentiation is deliberate adaptation, modification of curriculum. It meets the needs of all learners. So, we're looking at, and I like this one, the UDL comic, because we have, using comics to present, to show what I know. I like comics, so I'm going to use them. There's a different reason that we're maybe using, in this one, the comics as an example. What we want to make sure that differentiation is it's not a buffet. It's not getting a line order chef to come in and take everybody's order and do everything completely individualized for every single kid. Even with our students with IEPs, yes, their instruction is individualized, but it doesn't mean, one thing I know that I've heard more and more from parents, when we talk about an IEP and we say that they have an hour a day with a special educator, that's not an hour a day one-on-one with a special educator. That's an hour a day receiving specialized instruction, often from a special educator. But even in that case, we might be, making sure they have choice, but it's not up to the special educator to make every dish a little bit different. We work with the students to provide what it is that they need. And so is there a nuance of understanding? Absolutely. But what we don't want teachers to ever walk away with is the idea that we're saying to you, you have to do 35 different lesson plans, or my poor high school folks, we're not asking you for 150 different ways to do something. But what we're saying is really, what is it that you're trying to teach the kids? And how is the best way for them to show you that they learned what they know? So, yeah, this is really just a quick slide. I'm not going to spend that much time on it, but really kind of talking about why our twice exceptional kids need it. And really a lot of it keeps coming back to, we want them engaged. We want them to engage in meaningful ways, and we want them to develop positive skills. They will do all of these whys, they just won't necessarily do them in a positive way. If they're not engaged and they're frustrated with learning, they are not going to build a positive self-concept. They'll build a self-concept, but it won't be one that we want for them. They will engage in critical thinking. Again, it might not be the most critical thinking, in what we want them to. It might not build the concepts we want them to. They will come up with strategies and ways to get around things, but that's what they are. It's not executive functioning. It's not necessarily functional. It's just a way to get through. And a lot of times when they don't have choice, what we actually start to see is a lot of learned helplessness, because if you keep having to do the same thing over and over and over again that you don't understand, that you don't like, and that you're just not buying into, you're going to start to show some learned helplessness. I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. I'm not going to do this, because I never ever am able to do it. And so we want to be able to really also help them with their independence. So one thing, a lot of our twice exceptional kids, and especially as they get older, they really flip out about being singled out in the classroom. One thing, if you're doing differentiation, I'm going to say the right way, differentiation is available to everybody, so we're not singling out anybody. And again, I go back to like that keyboarding example. I do remember when we only had those Alpha Smarts for my young people. An Alpha Smart was literally a keyboard that had like a 2-inch screen on it, and it was just text. And you could type on it, and then you would like plug it in and download it into Microsoft Word, and you stood out a little bit. And then even when I was first teaching, and we had to like check out Chromebook carts, or we had to go get laptops, and we had to check out time in the computer lab, for a kid who had a typing accommodation, they could feel very left out. I know what I started to do was, instead of just getting the keyboards or laptops for my students, I would bring up a whole cart, because not everybody in the class wanted to type, but I made sure that we had enough that if people wanted to type, they would, and then my kids didn't feel as singled out. Our kids are also, I'm going to say most of the kids in general, they're so worried about their peers, right? Their peers have no idea what they're doing. And so sometimes, you know, the discussion with the student is really like, you know how much you notice about this other peer of yours? Yeah, that's about how much they notice about you. They're very self-centered, and so they think everyone's looking at them. And so sometimes it is more typical behaviors. Like, we have to convince all the high school kids that they are not the center of everybody's attention. But for our kids, it can lead into them refusing accommodations. So we want to make sure that we're helping them own what it is they need and how to use it, without making, while letting them know that it's something that's available for all.
And I would, if I could add one more thing, that's something that can become part of your classroom culture from the beginning of the year, is knowing that people need different things to grow. And I like to help my kids visualize it. The first week of school, I'll put up a picture of 2 different plants, and one will be like a cute little succulent, and the other will be a redwood tree. And I ask them to compare them and tell me what the differences are. And then I'll ask them, well, is the succulent bad at being a succulent because it's not as big as the redwood tree? And they'll go, no, except for a few jokers who will go, yeah, it's a bad succulent. And we talk about how they need different things to grow. The succulent would look very cute on my windowsill. The redwood, not so much. The redwood is, you know, part of a national park. The succulent, you probably trip over it, wouldn't notice. But they both have their purposes, and they both need different things to grow, and that's okay. And people need the same thing. Your success is not going to look like your classmates' success, because you're different people. And you might see me as your teacher providing you with different things, not because one person is smarter or better than the other, but because you are 2 different kids and you need 2 different things to be able to grow.
Absolutely. I kind of assume people have seen things like this before. I'm not really going to dive into this, but it's just kind of that, you know, where are we going and how do we get there? And then when we talk about differentiation, we talk about looking at student readiness, interest, and learning profile. You guys can kind of dive through this graph if you want to, but I want to get us into, I want to get us a little bit more into hands-on things. So I'm going to try and do this. Well, I'm going to make everyone seasick for a second. So I'm going to start the pre-assessment section before we go on break, and then go back to it. So how do we know what it is that our students need? When we're talking about what is student readiness and interest, we know we can do interest surveys. We know we can, you know, gauge where some of their areas of interest are. But when we're talking about readiness, there's a lot of different ways that we can go about this. We can use formal evaluations. We can look at those interest inventories, interviewing the kids, interviewing parents, observation, talking to other teachers, like we talked about with the PTD portfolios earlier. But One thing that I really believe in, and it's hard because our school system really struggles to allow space for this, is the need for pre-assessment. And when we talk about pre-assessment, I'm talking about pre-assessment of of things we already know. So I know one thing, I got into a little bit of a back and forth with our friends at Learn Zillion because when they were going over the pre-assessments and teaching us how to use them, I said, well, this is all pre-assessment to tell me if I have foundational skills, but how do we pre-assess to know if they already know all the content we're about to teach? And they just sort of looked at me and they're like, you haven't taught them that. How would they know it? And I'm like, well, that's why I need the pre-assessment, because if they already know it, I'm not going to spend time teaching it to them, but you haven't taught it to them yet, so they couldn't possibly know it. I saw real quick where that conversation was going, so I smiled and nodded and probably got kicked under the table by somebody. But truly, it's one of the things I love about this little graphic here, and that is actually what it says underneath. It was just super blurry. We want to know what the kids already know so that we can figure out how to best meet their needs. So, we talk about the readiness, where their skills, concepts, content knowledge, where their interest areas, and then what are those learning profiles? Where are their strengths and weaknesses? And that also can include things like work preference and self-awareness. I know one of the biggest changes, I'll talk about that later. So pre-assessments will tell us, does the student have the knowledge to move forward? Do they already know the content? Do they know the skills? Do they know content but not skills, or skills but not content, or both? Do they need enrichment because it's an area of interest for them and we want them to dig a little deeper? Do they need acceleration where they already have the foundational knowledge and so they can progress through the topic quickly? Or is this an area outside of a skill set where we're missing either background support or skills that we need in order to get there in the first place? So we're kind of looking at these different areas. Do we need to test for all of them every single time? No. But as we think about what it is we want to pre-assess, these are the questions that we should be asking ourselves of our students. And so one thing that I want to talk about here is the KWL chart versus the TWH chart. And I really like this one. And this is one of the examples I can't find. So during our break, I'm going to keep looking for this stupid website that I can't find. So we know the old KWL charts. What do you know? What do you want to know? What did you learn? Well, I can tell you the biggest issue with the KWL chart is, please do raise your hand if you've ever actually gone back to the L on what did you learn, because I can tell you I never have. So I just really have never mind charts. Whether I lose them or, we find other ways to assess, we don't really often come back to them. What I like about the TWH charts is we're asking a kid, what do you think about this topic already? What do you want to know about the topic? And then how do you want to learn about the topic? And so the examples that I want to pull up are going to kind of take us through different kids at different ages, telling us those, like volcanoes, for example. A student who says, like, I think volcanoes are really cool and I want to know why they blow up and I really want to make a volcano blow up. That tells us some stuff, like, volcanoes blow up. That's awesome. Versus the child who tells us, I'm really interested in learning about, I think the Ring of Fire is something that's really going to be important to know as we move forward, and knowing how plate tectonics work to cause some of these earthquakes and volcanoes. A little bit more. So then what do you want to know? Well, you want to know maybe how volcanoes impact weather. Two kids, if we're in the same class asking the same question, we already have an idea of different foundational knowledge that they have, different areas that they might want to explore. And then maybe our friend who wants to know more about plate tectonics doesn't really necessarily want to make the baking soda volcano blow up because they've done it before. Maybe they want to make a podcast to talk about their favorite volcano or their favorite volcanic eruption. We might have a kid who's not so sciencey, but they're really into history and they want to talk about historical eruptions. And, they're really interested in how when the volcano blew up in Iceland a couple of years ago and it canceled flights across Europe for weeks at a time. Like, there's different ways that we could look at this. And depending on what it is for that topic that we need to get them to, it tells us where our students are starting and gives us a better idea of where it is that we want them. It gives us a better idea of where we want them to be going. So I didn't learn anything and anger my teachers. This is why Hannah and I are becoming friends, because I probably would have done the same thing. One of the things I used to do the most that drove my especially US history teacher nuts, I used to, he'd have us watch movies and we'd write down all the questions beforehand, and then we would write the answers as we go. And I would write question, answer, question, answer, question, answer through the entire thing, which meant it also took me twice as long to write down all the questions because I was answering them as I went. It did not make him happy. On the other hand, I think if he had pre-assessed a lot of us in that classroom, I was just the most obnoxious about it. We're not surprised. All right, it is 8:06. I will have us come back here at 8:15, 8:16. I'm going to hit pause on the recording and resume recording. Okay. Yeah, so I threw the book in the chat. So the person who did this presentation, Tracy Inman, she does a lot of really cool differentiation strategies. And so one of them was her, this one was on how we use these KWL charts. So for example, this one, the topic was Civil War. What do you already know about this? I was so excited for my book. I didn't actually get anything to drink. So here we have him talking about like the type of clothing that they use, wanting to know more about where they eat, where they sleep, how many men were in each company, and then how much you want to learn about this. He's talking about field trips, projects, going to battlefields. Here's another example of asking a younger student, same questions, what do you know about electricity? He knows that circuits and batteries, wants to know how it works and why the wires are made out of copper, and wants to do experiments. So let's see. For this one, he asked, the question is like the road to revolution. I think I have a good understanding about the topic. Well, that doesn't tell us really what you want to know. I want to learn how life was 20 years after the war. I want to learn about the topic to see what took place. But here's another one that Road to Revolution. I know specific people. I want to know how Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton's conflict ended up bettering our country. I want to be able to watch videos, visually see things in front of me. So again, it's not a way for us to ask students what they know and get an idea of what their areas of interest might be. It doesn't have to be fancy. And yeah, we'll come back to those later. She has a lot of really cool differentiation strategies, and I'm not going to go over all of them because they can be overwhelming. I'm also going to find the right slideshow. There we go. All right, so that was just one version of a different type of pre-assessment that we could use. So the person I just sent the book to, she's like, oh, it's the fish book. I know the fish book. I have it in my office in Cleveland. I have it in my office in Rockville. I want to talk a little more about some different kinds of hands-on prep that you guys can do for specific things in your classrooms. All differentiation does not have to be difficult. It doesn't have to be time-consuming. Sometimes it is, but it doesn't have to be. So the first couple of things I want to talk about, and I will also own that I think a lot of times these can be a little more geared towards language-based courses. I do like that they actually have one that you can try it in other languages. So this is called the differentiator. And what I like about the differentiator, hopefully you guys can still see, I went from a screenshot to, okay. So what the differentiator does is it allows us to help students come up with their own differentiation pieces. So under the thinking skill, we have Bloom's here. We have from remember all the way up to synthesize. So we could give the students, you need to pick something from a specific category, or give them 2 or 3 categories to choose from and decide what it is that they want to do. The content, we have with either adding in our own prompts, or we can add second prompts if you want more than just a single prompt. They also have the depth and complexity charts. We haven't gotten to those in our Canvas page yet, but you guys will have a chance to look at the depth and complexity pieces. Our resources, how are you going to do this? What are you going to use in order to find the information? What are you going to come up with to show your thinking? And I do like this one thing here, and it, you know, cool looking product does not mean there was high level thinking. And I really like this. I heard this with Sheila Gallagher when she talked about the difference between project-based learning and problem-based learning, is that oftentimes we can do a really cool project and not really learn a whole lot. And so we want to make sure that when we're talking about what it is we're having the students do, that it's not just making, you know, a pretty drawing, but it's a meaningful drawing, or it's not just, you know, a debate where they easily sway each other, but like a debate that they're putting actual efforts into. So, you know, when we think about the different ways that we have our students do this, we want to make sure that the content is as rigorous as the presentation of content. And then the group size, this is actually a new piece that they have. If you want to do it in groups, these are different ways to add that part. You know, and I also do like, you know, this whole piece here. Often with our twice exceptional students, if we're going to do group work, we need to be really careful about how we're curating their groups, because you either have our student who wants to work alone, but might have IEP skills or things that they're working on where they are learning to work in groups, and that they need people who will work well with them. Sometimes we have our kids that are just too chatty, and, you know, we want to be careful about grouping them. We also sometimes have our kids who are verbal processors, and I know this often is my issue. I can overtalk. We're not surprised. Y'all have met me now for what, like more than a minute? But I'm also a verbal processor. So when I'm thinking my way through something, I need to talk about it. And sometimes the only feedback I get is because they're not really listening to me, which can be okay. I also know I can take over in a group. So that's a skill I always had to work on, was not overtaking the group, but also needing to be able to talk out all my thoughts so I could keep myself on track. So when we're thinking about how we're differentiating, or when we think about whether or not we're doing groups with our students, we really want to think about the specific needs of our twice exceptional students and try and curate groups that will allow them to be their most successful. So the next, can I do this? There we, nope, JK, let's try this again. So our next one is Respondo. And Respondo is very similar. It's, Respondo is very similar. It's very much an ELA based one. But what I really like about this is it uses the Scamper model. So substitute, combine, adapt, minimize, maximize, eliminate, rearrange. Scamper used to have a P in there instead of two M's, and I don't remember what the P was since they don't have it up here right now. That's okay. So in the idea of the Scamper skill is that it's a higher level of thinking that has the students putting information in different contexts. So for example, this one is saying, you know, for example, substitute the setting of the giver for the setting in The Wrinkle in Time, and then dramatize how it might affect the plot and create a skit to show that. So, you know, those are two books that are often read near each other within a curriculum. This could be a really good thing for if you have, if you're doing literature circles that are content-based or theme-based and not content-based, where all the students are reading different books, but they're in a lit circle together to talk more about themes. You have students who bring their own content to the discussion and then try and figure out how they might work together. I like that you can type in your own. You can do, you know, we do a lot of work with setting, conflict, and characters, especially in those middle school areas. And I really like that a lot of these pieces allow the students to have that more robust discourse, because, you know, we're talking about, in this case, we're talking about their ability to say, you know, how much does setting have an impact on plot? But we might also want to say, you know, how much would changing a setting have an impact on the theme, or how might it change the tone? One is darker than the other. You know, what if we gave them a children's story to contrast with this, and how, you know, we can change some of these pieces and have the kids really think through. One thing I also like with this is that these are very open-ended. There's no real answer to how this is going to change. And so it gives them that opportunity, that lower risk opportunity to have a discussion, because there is no definite outcome. There is no definite answer. And you can actually ask the same question to multiple groups and have multiple different answers because it's so open-ended. Like I said, these are very ELA-based ones, but I really like them. And I like some of the thinking that they have us do as teachers as to how we might be able to better engage our students. Another model we can use is called the PACE model. So this is when we use text, images, something that is provocative. So it's going to provoke emotion or provoke responses. Ambiguous. So like I just said with the scamper piece, you know, there's no solid answer. We want something that's ambiguous. We want something that's complex. So it has multiple different features, and something that really emotionally engages the students. So this is the picture that we've frequently used over the years. There's a lot going on in this picture. You know, is it provocative? Absolutely. This is Norman Rockwell's painting of Ruby Bridges going to school. You know, there's words in the background, there's the tomatoes on the wall, there's the little girl dressed in the pristine white dress, the, you know, grown-ups kind of around her where they're focused in here. There's a lot going on here. There's historical context going on in here. We could totally have a discussion about, is the historical context accurate, or is it meant to evoke other feelings or images? There's a lot of pieces going in here. One of the things with PACE model and using this is that you want to build your students and you want to build their ability to discuss. But the nice thing is that because of the way the model is, you could use it multiple times throughout the school year and you don't have to do a lot of prep for it. You know, this could be an opening to a unit. You know, we're talking about maybe civil rights, maybe we're talking about the impact of art on people. There's all sorts of things that you could pull with this and really like launch a unit and launch a discussion. And it also gets the kids being able to think, you know, what is their background knowledge? Do they have any idea of what this context is? Can they glean some idea of the context or what we might be speaking about? I think there's a lot that we could do with these models. And as far as prep work goes, practicing the model with the students is important so they get used to the format. But whatever it is you have up here discussing can be, it can change. As far as other topics go as well, you know, you could read an interesting article in science. You know, maybe you're getting into something on viruses and you have the students read, using the PACE model, a short article on something about viruses that you're coming up to. You can read something in historical context. If we're in history, you could read, you know, you could read a newspaper article from the time, you could read something fictional from the time, you know, anything that is going to draw the students in and really bring out that discussion. The other thing I like about this is that it encourages discussion, but it also is going to support our students who are not strong, who might not be strong with their vocabulary or with their language, because you can react to this without having to read an article. We don't have to have a lot of other supports in there. And for our students, you know, whether they're EML or twice exceptional or whatever their needs might be, you could possibly give them a short list of words that they might want, or a direction that you want them to go a little bit in their discussion to help prompt them in being able to respond to the class. So the other one I wanted to get into was the Venn diagrams, and this is another one of this is another one of Tracy's pieces. So give me a hot second. Tracy has a lot of good ideas. I'm not going to talk about mind maps today. I am happy to give you guys this link so that you can go through her So you can go through some of her strategies. But I really like the Venn diagram again because it's very low prep. They're circles. You can make something, the kids can make something. One of the things, and one of the other things I really liked about it was, as we talk through this, you can see how we could have kids who are at different places in instruction or different levels have meaningful discussions. So she does use Harry Potter as her example for this, and this was actually an exercise she did with one of her kids so that she could develop some examples for the process. But in this one, she was talking about different characters in the series. One thing I like about setting up this model where we start with just the single circle is this speaks to our kids who don't want to speak to anybody else. It also speaks to our students who might, depending on where you are in the book or what level of support students need, if they're starting independently, it gives them a chance to put their knowledge on the page without having to compete with peers or compete with others. And then we go to a more traditional Venn diagram. Don't need to talk about a Venn diagram. Although what I do like here is, seeing in the centerpiece here, like, what are these things that these two characters have in common? We add in here now Dumbledore. And so, again, it has that opportunity for the kids to discuss. And if you have, each of these people had maybe one of these characters, they're coming together, they're having to synthesize that information. They're having to have discussion about, how, does this go here or here? Does it go in multiple places? This is also for, if you again have students who have different levels of strength, whether in discussion or different levels of strength in having some of these more complex discussions, our students are coming to the table with something that they own. They own one of their characters. And so they might be coming to the table and being able to own just that piece of the character so that they can still contribute to the discussion. This one I'd not seen prior to Tracy's presentation, and I really, really liked it because the level of complexity here and I think the level of complexity with this one is really interesting because we have all of our traditional overlaps. We also have down here, where are things that only are true of these two characters or these two characters. But then you can also have different circles where 3 characters overlap and maybe the other ones don't. Again, I know this is an ELA example. I think we talked about being able to use a word bank potentially to support students here. Here we go. I actually have examples that are in English, and I knew they were here somewhere. So this one is an example of talking about parts of numbers and pieces of numbers. And if anybody here is a math teacher and wants to help me limp through this, awesome. So in the same way, we might have different people or different groups talk about what are different parts of numbers, what are fractions have in common, what makes up a fraction, what makes up a decimal. Then let's put them together. How do they overlap each other? Then we're going to bring in percentages. And then here we bring in ratios. There might be some kids who aren't ready for ratios. There might be some kids who are ready for ratios. So when you're thinking about differentiating within your classroom, if you could even do it essentially possibly as a pre-assessment for a single student where you have them do these different parts and figure out, because if a student can tell you what ratios and decimals and ratios and percentages have in common, they're going to need a lot different instruction than maybe somebody who's still trying to use a word bank to figure out where the words either go or overlap with these different terms and ideas. I do also like we have different shapes to the Venn diagrams where you can see she started with one person here and then what they have in common at the bottom. We got kind of carried away with different letters and things that you could put different shapes. I just kind of like the idea that we're not always having to go with circles, although I do like circles. So I did say I would put this in the chat before I forget. Oh. And that is a link to Tracy's Padlet. And I put the link to her book in there too, mostly to show I wasn't crazy and it really existed, but you guys have that too. So the last piece of the low prep that I want to talk about is with questioning. And I love this Einstein quote because it says to us, Most teachers waste their time asking questions which are intended to discover what a pupil does not know, whereas the true art of questioning has for it the purpose to discover what the pupil knows or is capable of knowing. And I really like the idea of flipping that question, because that's really what we want to pull out. If I want to know what a kid doesn't know, there's a lot of ways for me to figure that part out. But again, when we go back even to that idea of pre-assessment, why are we pre-assessing? We're pre-assessing because we want to know what they already know, what they're prepared to know, what they're not prepared to know that we need to guide them on, but what are they capable of learning? Questioning our twice exceptional students can be really beneficial. You have lower level questions and higher level questions. Sometimes it's about taking risk and building repertoire, it's building rapport. Sometimes it is about just acknowledging our students. Like a lot of times, questioning is where our twice exceptional kids are both provocative and shy because they want to tell you that they know everything, and they are going to keep telling you that they know everything until you know that they know everything, and then they'll tell you more. But it also gives them a chance sometimes, or gives us a chance to have them pause and think through things more deeply. A lot of our twice exceptional students have really strong background knowledge, but they will shy away from some of the higher level thinking because they don't always like the risk in having ambiguous questions or having to come up with ambiguous answers. And so questioning can be a way to help them develop some of those skills. So the first thing we can talk about are leveled questions. And, the leveled questions here, we're talking about different levels of risk as well as different levels of knowledge. So, the first question we have, the lowest level question we have, what are your feelings after reading the opening chapters of a book? It's a really short kind of intro way to get a student involved in just kind of talking about the book and talking about from their perspective. Also for students who may have maybe a little bit slower in reading, we're not saying, did you read chapter 1 last night, but in the opening sections of the book. So it gives people a chance to respond, even if they haven't been able to keep up with the entire reading and still be involved in the work. The next one we have, return to a place you in the story that you love, disliked, or questioned. Again, it has them find something specific in the book that's meaningful to them. We're learning more about them, but we're also having them express their opinion and give reasons. So when we talk about being able to find evidence, I don't mind when kids tell me they hate books. That's fine. But tell me why you hated it. I just didn't like it. It's never a good enough reason. It was stupid. The characters were annoying. I wanted this character to die the entire time. I have actually written that into essays before. Fine, but why? What was it about them? Their voice in my head sounded so whiny, I just could not stand to listen to them anymore. It's a really interesting thing, right? Because they've gotten invested enough in a character that they have a voice, and their voice is grating on them, and the character, the way it's developed, is not their cup of tea. I think that's kind of awesome because it's showing us the students' investment, and it's allowing them to pull what it is that they've connected with, even if they've anti-connected with the book. I don't know if that's a thing, but I'm saying it is. And then our last one, what is the author trying to say? So this is technically our highest level question, because they're really trying to develop. Alyssa said, that's how I feel about Harry Potter. You know what? I'm okay with that. I might not agree, but I'm okay with it. I can live with it. What is the author trying to say? So, this is really asking that question about theme and the bigger picture ideas. I also have had people tell me that they felt like they could flip this around where, depending on the contents of the book, maybe what is the author trying to say about life through the novel? Yes, theme is often a difficult discussion. It's a higher level discussion to have. But for some students, that also might be a really low risk question because it's not putting the focus or emphasis on them. Whereas a question about how are you feeling after the book, well, depending on what the book is, that might be too close to home. That might be too high risk emotionally for them to answer. So I know one thing that some of the things that I used to do when I was offering questions, when I was offering questions to my students is if I were leveling questions, I would tell them that they were leveled. Because I also found with some of my, especially when I was teaching 10th and 11th grade, there were times where my kids had an AP test that week and they just really didn't want to think too hard about English. And I had to deal with that. And that was fine. But there were also times where I'm like, you don't have an AP test this week, and I do need you to think a little harder about English. And so we would often, have like we call it like an entry level question, and the top question was, I think I'm taking AP Lang next year. So, you know, we kind of had a trajectory, and we tried to get the students to mix them up, but giving them the opportunity sometimes to say, I just don't want a hard question today. I'll answer a question for you, but I'm not answering a hard question for you. And then letting them pick what they felt like was the hard question. We still got them to engage to show us the skills that they had, but it gave them that level of choice. So we have a great example in real life. One of my ELC students asked to switch novels halfway through because she couldn't stand the author's repetitive use of vocabulary and the characters whining. I have a couple of books like that right now that they're formulaic. I am aware of what I'm reading, but after a while, I'm like, if you say that word one more time, I'm going to throw my Kindle across the room because I just can't take it anymore. I am a person who can't not read a book. I have to read it to the end, no matter how much I hate it. But I really buy into how much I hate it sometimes. But I do feel, you know, there are very few books that I have never finished. The Hobbit is one of those books I have never finished. I've tried multiple times. But yeah, I feel, yeah. And that's exactly it. Like, I would rather a kid tell me they hate a book and they want to change books than never read again because they hated the book so much. So, you know, I think there's a lot of benefit to giving them that opportunity. I'm willing to try The Hobbit again. My husband keeps telling me I should skip The Hobbit and go straight to Lord of the Rings. But I started it when I was like 9 and I was like over it after the 3rd chapter. And I don't know if I picked it up again. I tried once, but anyway, I'm digressing. Question cubes. So question cubes are just a more kinesthetic way to ask questions in class. I will also tell you, this is one of those times, these are so simple. It took me so long to figure out how to use them that like I just have to call myself out on my own randomness on this piece. But really what it is it gives the kids the opportunity to roll the dice and come up with questions to answer. So if you have a group of kids that, you know, they either ask a lot of really low level questions or they can't decide on a question, they just don't know what it is, giving them the opportunity to roll the dice and have that choice taken away from them in a lot of ways or giving them more choice. It's a different way to help evoke opportunities for questioning. The other thing I've done, because I also don't necessarily like to sit there and create question cubes, is that I'll give them like, you know, 1 is this, 2 is this, and I give them regular dice to roll. And the nice thing is, you know, enough people are into things like D&D nowadays that you can get lots of sided dice so that you can have different questions and the kids can roll to create their own questions without having to make the question cubes. Oh, well, we're back on that. I really like question matrix. The question matrix, it gives them, let's see if I did what I think I did. I did not. Okay. So I like the question matrix because it builds us from simple questions to complex questions. I also like it because for me, it was a way to, we use it sometimes to have the kids, like when they were prepping for Socratic seminars, we would have them use this as that strategy to help them create the questions that they were going to ask. The other thing I've done to try and force or support some of the differentiation in this is I would assign points. So like who is 1, what is 2? So you have 7 points down and 7 points across. And I would give the kids a amount of points that they had to spend to write their questions. And I might even limit them on, you know, you can only ask 3 3-point questions and then you have to go somewhere else. So it forced them to do a little bit of math. I'm not always hating on the math. It allowed them to be more creative in their questions. It pushed them out of their comfort zone a little bit. And it often would help them understand, you know, who didn't do that? Why didn't they do that? Those are kind of, you know, they feel like lower level questions, but they can become more complex. And so just kind of helping them move through the matrix and see how they could develop their own questions went a long way to building discussion. And this was also something that I would frequently give in small groups where they might start with questions and then, you know, inevitably you end up with we're done. If they have a question matrix in front of them, you know, have you answered one of each of these columns? If not, let's go back and create some questions for us to answer. And it helps them continue the conversation without finishing too quickly. The other thing we can do for some simple responses is on varying individual response cards. So again, we don't need 35 questions for 35 kids, but we might have some kids who are still learning, what is a simile or a metaphor, and might have some kids who are ready for those examples. And so, it's just a matter of passing out the cards to kids, having them in 2 different stacks so who you're handing which questions to, and it gives them a chance to show where they've grown, as they've worked through as they've gone through the work for the day. And so just like with the pre-assessment, when we have these post-assessments, we can still post-assess at a higher level than we may have intended to originally, because the students are starting out with more knowledge than we anticipated. All right, I have 12 minutes left. I'm going to try and go through the high prep differentiation. I think I can do it. Yeah, question matrix also makes for good wall art, because you can have it up there on the wall for the year. And, I've also seen people do like index cards where they will have the kids look at the question matrix on the wall and maybe write their question on index card, stick it up there, and then we can answer each other's questions during there. There's lots of different things you can do it. But I like the wall, and I also like the kids having their own copy or having a copy in the discussion folders. I used to do a discussion folder that had sentence stems for starting discussions, for interrupting discussions, for agreeing and disagreeing. I had rules of, just general social discourse, because some markets just need that. And then I would have a question matrix in that folder as well. So anytime we did group discussions, I passed them out, because some kids needed the rules every single time and some kids didn't. But if I made it available to everybody, it at least gave me an extra minute before I had to go over there and remind them of what the rules were. So I love me a raft. This is one of the few things I will say it was my responsibility to learn what a raft was in grad school and do a presentation on it for my class. And it's probably one of the only things I've ever really kept. And I still like. And I like it because it gives a lot of flexibility and a lot of creativity. I'm just going to go through. So basically, raft, we're talking about what is the role of the person who is presenting, what audience do you speak to, what is the format you're choosing to present your information, and what is the topic that you're writing about. So our first example here is a math raft. So the math raft in this one, what role do you want to take on? Do you want to be a decimal and your audience is a customer, and you're doing a petition for proof or check for set membership? Do you belong as part of this numerical set? We have parts of a graph, TV audience, how do you read a graph, and creating a script on how to teach that. We have our social studies raft. This is one of my, I don't know why I really like this one. We have the death of the Confederate soldier writing a complaint letter about Pickett's charge. So you have to know some stuff about Pickett's charge so that you know why you're complaining to Robert E. Lee and what your complaints are. I did also like the Great Wall of China, their own diary of the invasions that I have stopped and seen, and what have I, experienced in my different years. And again, if you're writing this across a class, maybe you give them different chunks of time so that you're not reading the same invasions over and over and over again. But what have you done in this period of time? What have you done during this period of time? It just gives them that opportunity to be creative, but they're still showing what they know or what they've learned. The English raft, I'm going to say, is my favorite because I created it, and I still know that they're still using this as the beginning. In the beginning of the Odyssey, there's kind of a lot going on in a short period of time that is a little bit important, but not super important. And so really it's when we're learning about Penelope and how she is coping with having her husband gone for 20 years and all these people are trying to marry her. And so what I really liked about this was, again, it was that creativity piece. So Penelope having her playlist for a party when you're not looking for love. And what we had the kids do is they actually had to have 10 songs, and they had to explain why they picked those songs for their playlists. And when we first envisioned this, we got typed documents. There were years I had some kids who made like a CD cover for me or a record cover, and had their explanations on there. I had one kid who actually who actually gave me a playlist that we could actually listen to, which was kind of fun to, even though I knew a lot of the songs, it was just something nice and different to, it was something nice and different to hear the voices of the kids and to get to, again, kind of know them as, to get to know them as learners and have them express that creativity. Here's our science one. I may go down with the experience drop of water because I think that was kind of fun. The travel guide through the water cycle. So water cycle is something that we really need to learn when we're in those science classes. And so really taking them through. I also have done ones with the carbon cycle. The metamorphosis rock cycle, you know, is another great one that they can do. But just all those opportunities about being able to express what it is that they have learned or what they are learning. As far as time goes, the biggest part of the prep on this is always you trying to come up with it and then giving them time to work around it. This can be a great anchor activity. I also found that these were ones that I might give them, you know, in the beginning of a week and then a week or two to work on it while we were doing other stuff in class. So generally speaking, the more creative it is, the more the kids are to listen to it or to participate in it. And so the more willing they are to do it in their off time, especially for secondary. So I think it was, you know, that's really where a lot of the prep is. Once you kind of get the idea of how to do the raft and also how to do a rubric, and I will say it's one of the big pieces also with the rubrics for me was my rubrics were based on, you know, did you accomplish your role? Did you meet your audience? Did you follow the format? And did you nail key evidence of topics? So you don't want to get too into the weeds where every single line has a different rubric. And that's where sometimes people get themselves tripped up. Now, obviously, like with our science one here, these are very, very different topics. But generally your raft is going to be based on the unit you're doing. So you want to make sure, you know, you're clear in what your expectations are. You know, you need 5 facts, you need 3 facts. You know, you want them to tightly follow a format. You want them to loosely follow a format. And then you can kind of go ahead and that way you're grading consistently, but with very different products. Yeah, I am a big fan of rubrics. Oh, here are a whole bunch of different ways that you can think of different rafts. So think-tac-toe. Think-tac-toe is, you know, it's kind of like that tic-tac-toe idea. What I do like about this is it allows you to do things like, say, your center block is something everyone is going to do. And then they can, you know, make a X, they can go 3, whatever, crisscross 3 in a row, however they want to do that. You can do boards that are beyond the 9 squares and just have them do a certain number of activities, but you also can think about in here, you know, do you want them to do, if you want them all to do something the same, making sure that you strategically place that, but it gives the kids an opportunity to have different things that they could do. And then usually what you would do in each one of these is like, they wouldn't all be about theme or they wouldn't all be about characters, but you'd have some that were on characterization, some that were on plot. I know I'm going back to English as an example. But you would have different strategies or different ideas in each one. And again, with your rubric on this one, what, you know, did they nail the concept? Did they nail the format? And did they do whatever other piece that you decided was important with that rubric? I do love choice menus, and I've done these in different ways before, but the idea that one, you know, you have this opportunity to have a $10 meal. And this is really where we're differentiating by point values and differentiating by complexity as well. So, you know, an entree is going to take write and design a children's book with 2 or more elements. That's going to take a lot more work than doing a single vocab page. When I did this with our students, I would frequently tell them, you know, you can't have an entire meal of appetizers. You really can't. You got to have something more substantive in your work. So when you're thinking about how to create these different choice menus, making sure that they have multiple opportunities, but also making sure that they're kind of being forced to do things in different elements in different areas. The other way I've done the choice menus before is more of a points, again, a points thing where I might have I didn't call it a menu, so it was worked a little bit differently, but I would have like the $10 meal. So the $10 meal was the most complicated, and it would involve a lot of different things, a lot more research, possibly a lot more independent work. The nice thing with the choice menu is often these are very short to shorter. And so for kids who want a lot of different things to do, this is really nice. And then if you have like those bulkier menu options for the kids who really want to dig into something deeply, that's a really great way to get them to dig in. The imperatives, negotiables, and options, or the, can do, must do's. I like this one. Select a chemical problem. You must select this. How are you going to show the problem that exists? And then you're going to develop the talking paper, future solutions. So again, oh, I'm sorry, I misread that. So this is the imperatives piece. The negotiables are, you have to do one of these, either timeline or approximate costs. And then the optionals, you can do a cartoon, you can do a fictionalized account of a person in the area, or do a PSA. So you've got, we have to learn about some type of chemical problem. We have to have a map. We have to have something written. You can absolutely try any of these strategies for your primal project. Here's more of the choice ideas. And even in ones that are imperative, there's still choice. You're selecting the problem, but it's going to be something we've been talking about. Now, I will always have a kid who's like, well, can I talk about how like animal extinction as a result of ozone depletion or as a result of acid? Sure. If you want to get more specific, I can usually allow that. I've had some kids who like, I'm not going to say some kids. I was personally the one who would go through this and say, what could I do to be contrary just because I can? As long as it stayed within the flavor of it, I want to know that you understand a chemical problem with the environment. We don't have to be super, as long as it's a chemical problem with the environment, we can make it fall into these different categories. And then there's the anchor activities. And what I really like with anchor activities, and I think this is our last one. I hope this is our last one. What I really like with anchor activities is that it's meaningful work for students when they're done, or when they're stumped, or when they're just totally sick of whatever it is you're supposed to be doing right now. There are plenty of times, I know I do it too. I am just absolutely sick of what I'm supposed to be doing right now. It's why we end up with pretty PowerPoints, because I'm supposed to be doing something else. But what the anchor activities do is it still ties you into what the work it is that we're wanting us to do. So an example I actually have taught before was when I was teaching House on Mango Street. I wanted some stuff for the kids to do because it can be an intense story, and sometimes kids need a little more direction and understanding the content, even though it seems very straightforward. So one thing I really like is that Sensor Cisneros had another story, 11, and I felt like the Esperanza in the first part of House on Mango Street is about the same age as Rachel in 11. And so I would have the kids read one or two of the chapters from House on Mango Street and then compare them to Rachel in the short story 11. I also really love that there's an imagery of a balloon in both of the stories. And so again, it's really more of a deep part, like there's a lot that could be going on with the imagery of the balloon. You really do have to read and understand both stories. Not everyone's going to get there, but these were different ways that the kids could dig into what we were doing without having to do what everyone else was doing. The other one I really liked with this one was, one thing I found that was very interesting is that the House on Mango Street is translated into Spanish, but it's transliterated, not translate. It is translated in a way that it would be, it's the same as it is in English. I'm not doing a good job of explaining this one. Interestingly, Cisneros did not translate her own work. It was done by a translator. And I had lots, it's a word-to-word, word-for-word translation. And it was really interesting because one year that I taught this, I taught it in credit recovery. And the majority of the students I had were students who had graduated from, I get them all mixed up. Basically, they had graduated from the end of their EML learning, and so they had to take English 9 in order to graduate. So they were all students who were good students, but because they had come in as English language learners, they were taking English after school with me. And so because of that, I actually had this opportunity for them. I downloaded the book. I purchased the books in Spanish, and I had them sit down and read a chapter of their choice and read it in English and read it in Spanish. And it was really interesting to find out, one, Cisneros is Mexican American, but not everything in the book sounded, they told me, like a Mexican American would speak. Um, one of the best discussions I had was the students saying how, how something was written in the book was like totally the opposite of how they would say it in their own dialect of Spanish. And we just had this really rich, amazing discussion about what was lost by having it word to word translated instead of translated by a native speaker. How things were said differently in different cultures, or phrases that might be used that I really wish I remembered one of them. But they said, like, it was in one dialect, it was meant as a more of derogatory term, whereas in the dialect we were reading, it was word to word translated, so it was meant positive because that's how it was written in English. One of my very favorites is Esperanza's name means hope, right? I think that's right. And so in the very beginning, she says, my name is Esperanza, which in Spanish means hope. But the book says, my name is Esperanza, which in Spanish means Esperanza. And we talked about how that just sort of really diminishes in some way, like the point that she's making there, because then she goes on about how it sounds on the tongue. And of course, you don't quite get that same level of translation. So it was a really interesting opportunity, and also an opportunity for the students to be able to own their culture and talk about how, just because you were just because you spoke Spanish, they all had the chance to say that doesn't mean that this speaks to us in front of us, or that just because you're providing text in Spanish doesn't mean that it speaks to us. And then this is the raft that we did with that. So, and you can see one of the things on here was that they could write an Amazon review. And posting the reply was actually on Google Classroom. They were not actually going to Amazon to post their responses. And then one of them is I actually downloaded I downloaded a review that was written supposedly by a 7th grader where they called it a girl book. And so I actually had them respond to the topic, is this really a girl book, and kind of about that. So, and I did let them do an internet troll because, they were 9th and 10th graders and they needed to have the time to have their opinions. So I went a little bit over, I'm sorry, but hopefully that gives you guys some more hands-on ideas of things that we can do to support our learners. Yes, I saw in the chat, anybody, if you like these activities and you want to flat out steal them or translate them or whatever it is for your particular subject area. If you're not an English teacher and you want to give me examples that are non-English, I love having non-English teacher examples. Yes, they will be. I just realized they're not posted yet, and I apologize. They will be up on Canvas, so that you guys can access them. And I know I have at least one, if not more, world language teachers. I would love if you guys do any of these strategies, especially the high prep strategies. For other world languages, because that is a question I get frequently, is like, kind of how might you use these? And I don't particularly care what language they're in because I speak 0 of them. I speak really, really basic, bad elementary Russian. So unless you're teaching really bad elementary Russian, I can't read anything you write. But just any examples would be amazing to have. And with that, so we have our last class. I cannot believe we have our last class already on Thursday. We do have Matt Fugate speaking for about an hour. And I believe what Hannah and I were going to do is we were going to post, we're going to post an opportunity for you guys to ask questions, anything that we feel like we haven't touched on very much. We're going to go ahead and put that up in Google Classroom. God, it's late and I'm tired. We're going to put that up in Canvas, and we will do our best to answer those questions for you guys. We will have some other material to go over if you don't, but I feel like we've covered a lot of stuff. And I know when you look at our Canvas page, we have some areas that we haven't necessarily directly addressed, but we've kind of infused it in what we've been doing. So hopefully, hopefully we have that. Yes, you're right. If you submit anything in good Russian, I will not grade it because I probably won't understand it. I'm going to go ahead and hit stop.